And in fact, the reason I'm here is because our program director in my institute, Dr. Mei Wang, whose position in the institute is to look at funding through our extramural division, was unable to come. She sends her regrets. So I'm here in her stead. Let me start with this. I had to show a picture, I guess. And so this is an aerial view of the main campus of NIH. The arrow there pointing, there are two things I want to point out using this picture. The arrow that points there is Building 1, which is where the director of NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, has his office. And most of the political decisions, as well as a lot of the funding decisions, come out of that particular building. Now, Dr. Collins is gone frequently. However, when he is there, he drives up to campus in his Harley. He has a parking spot for it. And he usually is carrying his guitar. As a matter of fact, his last public performance was at a genetics conference where he was talking about genetics, and shortly after that, then he performed with Aerosmith, which is what my grandchildren tell me is a musical group. And I was trying to think of whether or not they somehow fit into the funding scheme of NIH, but that just gives you the idea that the NIH is open to many different types of multidisciplinary collaborations. Now, the other thing I want to point out about the campus here as you're looking at this, that there are no horses on that campus. And in deference to my colleague, Dr. Berger, although there are no horses there, the NIH funds a great deal of work in equine encephalitis. And the benefit goes predominantly to the University of Kentucky, I think. Having visited there at Joe's gracious invitation, I could see that the funds have been used very well there. All right, so let's talk about the NIH and the way it funds its grants there. These are ways in which the budget to the NIH, where probably 90% of all of the dollars that come into the NIH is put to use for extramural funding. In other words, they leave the campus, they leave the university, they leave the NIH, and they go to universities predominantly, as well as many other kinds of institutions for basically doing fundamental research. Although it could be fundamental basic research, it certainly could be translational research, absolutely clinical research. There are many ways in which these funds are distributed. They're always competitive. They're always reviewed by external boards. And the external boards are usually called study sections, and they're not individuals at the NIH at all. They are individuals like yourselves sitting in this room. So study sections review proposals that come in. The predominant proposals are research grants, usually in the form of hypothesis-driven research grants. They're called R01 type grants. I'm sure many of you know what that is all about. Hypothesis-driven grants from individual investigators or potentially group of investigators. Amongst all of the funding institutes at the NIH, of which there are 24 in many of these institutes and centers, then the majority of their budget and extramural will go towards these types of research grants. There are many other ways that actually funds are given out from the NIH. There are many different career development awards, and there's a strong emphasis these days on particularly looking at junior investigators who are yet to get into the system of funding work. As everybody knows as well, the budget line for the NIH is modest in terms of new dollars coming in. And there are commitments already made for long-term projects at the NIH. Frequently, if a proposal, if a grant gets funded, it will not only be funded for its first year, but it will be funded for many outlying years. That could go as far as 4 or 5 years. Program project grants may be even longer than that, but there's a recognition then if dollars come in to compete. It's difficult for junior investigators to compete with more senior investigators. They don't have the same track record. They don't have long publication lists. They don't have a lot of infrastructure built up in their own laboratories. So I know at our institute, although the pay line for research grants currently is approximately 10%, in other words, of the 10 grants that come in, 1 will be funded. The pay line for junior investigators is closer to about 20 percentile. And this would give a chance for junior investigators to get a leg up and start their careers. There are many different kinds of training and fellowship grants also that come in from universities for junior fellows. There's a strong emphasis on clinical fellows and clinical scientists. There are many different kinds of programs that allow a clinical scientist in his or her junior career to come in and actually, if interested in research, take advantage of these kind of fellowship programs so it relieves them to some extent of perhaps some of the clinical duties so they can spend more time in research. There are larger program, project, and center grants where you have multiple investigators collaborating perhaps within one institute or university or amongst other universities as well, collaborative grants. These are called PO1s. There are a variety of different kinds of mechanisms there. Just as an example of that, our National Institute of Aging is the institute that predominantly funds work on Alzheimer's disease. Our institute, the Neurology Institute, has a very, very small portfolio on Alzheimer's because that's the predominant interest of the Aging Institute. Most of its dollars in extramural funding of projects are done in big center grants for Alzheimer's instead of individual R01 type hypothesis-driven individual investigator grants. And that's a decision that that institute had made some time ago. And resource grants now are actually, for example, used for, let's say, for establishing or keeping large primate colonies that an institution would have a very difficult time doing on its own. IT, for information technology, issues like that, and also some building funds as well. There's a strong emphasis now on translational work and drug discovery. Dr. Collins has made this a part of his administration at the NIH and actually is currently creating a new center that will be directed towards advancing translational research. It's called NCATS. And as soon as our Congress decides what they're going to do with our budget, they'll turn their attention and passing the law which will establish this particular NCATS Institute. So there are a number of particular ways in which funds can be distributed by these research grants. And the grants come in. Sometimes institutes will make the decision that they want to take a look at a particular area. One of the things that I will do when I go back as a result of the two-day conference here is to confer with my colleagues in our extramural division to say this is an important field, this is an important area. The regulators, our sister agency at the FDA, and their counterpart, the EMA, have determined that this is critically important. There are things, they have a research agenda. We talked about this. Why doesn't the institute, my institute, NINDS, take a look at this and say, perhaps we would like to take some of our extramural budget dollars and then direct it towards specific areas. Choose one or two of the, let's say, the items on the research agenda, and then put out what's called a request for a proposal or request for an application. When something like that happens, then the institute will say, we'll set aside so many dollars for this. They'll be able to fund 2 or 3 grants, whatever that is. Those grants will come in. They'll be evaluated by external experts in the field. That will not be people like me who sit there at NIH, but they'll be people like you who are here from other kinds of universities or divisions. And that's called a special emphasis panel, and they will then give the recommendation to the institute to fund these grants. Otherwise, grants come in particular cycles, and they go through the Center for Scientific Review. That center will decide where the grant should go, and there are different study sections that cover all the different divisions within that. So there's a process by which all of that is done. In our institute, it is always done by competitive review. There is nothing that the institute comes in and says, okay, I like this, so I want to do that. It's always done by external review. So let's take a look back now at JC and PML, and let me say, again, that it's been interesting over the 3 years where we have data that have been collected, that the amount of awards in various categories then for JC and PML has pretty much remained static over the last 3 years. In 2008, 2009, 2010. And these are the different institutes, actually, that have provided funds in this particular area for JCPML. The Neurology Institute is the chief institute that funds this kind of work, so it has more projects funded than the other institutes. But they could go and they could say, well, let's talk to our colleagues at Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and perhaps they'll help fund this particular kind of work. And NIAID will say, well, if neurology is going to put in, let's say, $1 million or $1.5 million, we'll put in $500,000 or whatever that is, and down the line, the Cancer Institute and the other institutes that are there as well. So there's a good deal of collaboration and cooperation amongst the institutes to push forward a certain kind of agenda to see that this work can be funded. Let's take a look at specific dollars then. We're always interested in specific numbers. We're all data generated enthusiastically. So let's just take a look at 2010, where NINDS, for this specific area of work, funded projects with a little over $6 million. Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, that year contributed not quite $1 million. In the past, you could see they put in more. That depends upon the grants that come in, where they are, and how they are reviewed. So it may seem as if, for example, certain fields don't get as much dollars as some of the other fields do, and that's certainly the case. That could be by design, by policy. You know, sometimes it's that where there weren't proposals that came in order to be able to do the reviews and to see whether or not they could be funded. You could simply go down that list. Alcohol abuse and alcoholism, interestingly enough, in this particular, if you just look at this chart, looks as if they put in quite a bit of money, over $1 million in JC and PML. That's a little unusual. However, that particular project was associated with the neurologic complication of HIV infection, of which JC and PML was a part. And so when you categorize these things and you have them in codes and you try to call up that, in fact, not $1.1 million was put into JC and PML. That was a part of a larger grant. But if you take a look at the sum total of all of that, then in 2010, there was $10,372,000 that was spent out of the NIH budget for work on JC and PML. If you were to compare that with multiple sclerosis, for example, NINDS spends about $100 million a year in MS research of all kinds. Basic science, animal models, clinical trials. So if you just do the numbers with the total amount of budget that the NINDS has, JC and PML is about maybe 0.3% of the total budget, and MS is quite a bit more than that. And you could just go through the list of the more than 300 neurologic disorders and stroke that NINDS gets applications to study. So what are the roadblocks to looking for funding for PML research? We talked about this before, and let me reemphasize this. It is a difficult agent to work with, and because of that, there are very good investigators that I know I have talked to in the past who've got wonderful technologies, but choose to take their techniques and methods and interest in infectious diseases of the brain to work on other systems. Because actually the biology, the molecular biology, or the clinical history of other kinds of infections are, quite frankly, a little bit more manageable to work with. In many attempts to be able to get more investigators involved in this kind of work, the singular reason that I have been told, well, we're not going to work on this, is because, again, this is a really tough agent to work with. The biology systems that you have to have are a little bit more difficult to work with in a laboratory setting, and certainly as a rare disease, that's another component of it as well. So we've seen the rest of this list before. So let's go back to something that I began to talk about yesterday, and looking at other ways to eliminate these roadblocks and perhaps have roadmaps for funding PML research. So I used as an example a system called the HIV Latency Collaboratory, which came actually from the extramural community, from academics and industry, in terms of solving the issue of HIV and sites of latency within HIV-infected individuals. In order to be able to accomplish that, then what they had chosen to do is to say, we need to bring all the players together. And that's been a theme for today, for sure. I know Janice this morning had talked to us about how some of these things came about with HIV, and I was on the NIH campus at the time in the mid-'80s, or the early '80s and the mid-'80s, when the whole issue of HIV infection became certainly a global epidemic, and how that mushroomed into changing, at least in the US, the way that federal agencies looked at how we fund this work and how we operate. It absolutely, as Janice said this morning, changed the way we did our business. And there's a lesson to be learned there, I'm sure. So the stakeholders in this HIV latency collaboratory are certainly industry, pharma and biotech, critically important. Government, the agencies that fund work predominantly in the United States. For public funding is the NIH. As I said yesterday, the total budget of the NIH is $32 billion. The vast majority of that goes into funding fundamental research. Our Department of Defense actually funds quite a bit of work, interestingly enough, funds quite a bit of work in prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob. And the reason that started is because the military has deployed their forces throughout the world. And so their stakeholders are in many different countries, where if you remember particularly, and since we're here in the UK, where there's the issue with the variant Creutzfeldt and bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and there were a lot of US troops who were potentially exposed to that. So the generals in the Pentagon said, we're going to put $300 million into this, much more than the NIH spends on that. So there are many different kinds of ways that that comes about. That was really kind of interesting. We had already heard about how the EMA and its collaborators here in Europe do that. So there are public funders that do this kind of work. The Defense Department, interestingly enough, spends quite a bit of money on breast cancer research. And actually, the Department of Energy in the United States is the department that initiated the Human Genome Project. They put more money into that than the NIH even dreamed about. And it was only because of that where the NIH kind of felt, and I will say this because I've been at the NIH long enough, they felt a little embarrassed by that. That it was the Department of Energy that said, we're going to solve this. And the NIH said, no, we're going to solve this. And it became a poker game. And that's terrific then, because then everybody wins with that. And that's actually through that process that we got James Watson to come to campus for a little bit of time, who then got Francis Collins to come to campus, who was the head of the Genome Center, and that later on was then named the director of the NIH, which is, by interest, a direct presidential appointment. The President of the United States names the director of the NIH. That's why we change directors of NIH frequently, I guess. The other funding institutes that actually it's been interesting over the years are coming to have tremendous amount of influence are the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Howard Hughes Foundation, which is only a stone's throw from the NIH. And they do a wonderful job actually funding Howard Hughes medical investigators, basic, pretty fundamental research. And there's a strong collaboration with the Howard Hughes Foundation and the NIH, and we talk with them frequently. We have many of their fellows who come onto campus, actually. The Gates Foundation has always been fascinating to me because if you have the Howard Hughes Private Foundation on the one side that want to do fundamental basic research, and that just for the sake of the science, the word application doesn't follow into that at all. Then if you look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which now, as we know, has increasingly put dollars into research, particularly in infectious diseases, they're just the opposite. They're practical people. How can we get a vaccine in the middle of a desert where we don't have to go ahead and store it in a refrigerator and somebody could swallow a pill and they won't get malaria? Tell me how you can do that, and we'll give you $10 million over 5 years to be able to find that. So, and we talk with the people at the Gates Foundation. Their approach is entirely different, but they're making an impact, particularly globally, on the kind of work that they like to fund. I think that's fascinating to see that. I've been at the NIH now for 30 years. The NIH used to be the only federal agency that funded research, and that isn't true any longer. We see now that private industry is funding a good deal of work. Howard Hughes is as well, the Gates Foundation. And they're increasingly becoming a percentage, a valuable percentage of fundamental work that's done. Academic institutions, of course, centers of excellence. So let's put all of these people together. And let's see, as they said here, what something like that would look like. So I substituted in this slide the word JC for HIV. And let's say, just as a matter of conversation, we would actually take a look at something like this. Because as I said yesterday, I have been remarkably surprised and impressed with not only the complexity of this, but the quickness with which this has been put together. Doug Richmond, Roger Pomerantz, a few other individuals published this in Science a couple of years ago. And as I said, and where you can publicly go onto this, just Google HIV Collaboratory, you can get publicly available information on the recent awards that have been made. And there are all kinds of ways to be able to do this. One of the things that I think this tells me and other individuals back on campus is that, in fact, there really are no roadblocks to this. They're only innovative, creative ideas where there's energy to put it together. So each of these components, there's a federal agency component, there are academic institutions, there are pharma and industry. All three are required in order to be able to dip into these funds to have them competitively reviewed. So NIAID, Allergy Infectious Diseases, actually is the institute at NIH that has formalized this and using another mechanism of funding called cooperative agreements. And we heard about that earlier this morning as well from the EU side. Here, they're cooperative agreements. Now that's interesting for the NIH because the NIH says you need to go ahead and work together. And if you do, then we'll help fund these projects as a cooperative agreement, and we have a right to sit at the table to see how things are going and to manage the data, and it's a collaboration with a federal agency, with pharma and biotech, and an academic center as well. All the other arrows and lines are absolutely arbitrary and negotiable. So an academic institution gets together with biotech and pharma and says, well, why don't we put in with this? They call the NIH and says, we have this good idea. We'd like to put this together. You know, we could do this cooperative agreement. We could go ahead and then align yourselves with how that would take place, who does what. You put together a big program project. This was done because there is a particularly difficult problem with HIV infection globally, is where is this virus latent and how could you make a vaccine if in fact you can't flush out the sites of latency? Isn't going to work. $500, $600 million a year out of the NIH for vaccine trials. Doesn't look like we're going to get a good vaccine soon. But that's a lot of money to put into it. So they said, let's take a look and see how we're doing our business, and let's do it a little bit differently then. So all of the details of that are worked out. Collaborators get together, and they come up with a proposal. There'll be a principal academic institution that will have perhaps the PI that will kind of oversee this. This is kind of like a program project grant, and they divvy up the work. Who's got the resources? Who's got the technology? How do we share on that? They write the proposal. They send it in for review, because these are all, again, competitive reviews. There's an oversight board. Call it what you wish. Call it a board of directors. Call it an oversight board. I like the idea of calling these kinds of things steering committees. It seems to be less onerous. But whatever works. So they all do that and put together an idea, and let's say we just changed the name from HIV to JC. Where's JC latent? What kind of animal models do we really need to have? Can an individual investigator can actually go ahead and write an R01 grant saying, I'm going to develop an animal model for PML? I don't think so. I think that's going to be technically too difficult. But we can, in fact, if we work together with all the stakeholders here, the NIH and its resources and abilities at academic institution and pharma. So in a public announcement that had just come up, that's available. So I'm not, again, going into any of the coffers of the cabinets that are locked at NIH on this. So I just want to point out that, again, as I said yesterday, there was $14.5 million spent in the first year for this, in a program that was just published as a concept idea 2 years ago. I stress that because I've been at the NIH long enough, and normally we can't get new paper towels in the laboratory in a 2-year period of time. But all of a sudden, this big complex association has gotten together. And I think we can certainly make the case of the need to be able to have some of the items on this research agenda addressed, particularly if you come to something like the NIH and say, we've got an innovative idea, and we could say, actually, we've been impressed what our colleagues in HIV did, because actually, JC is and PML is an AIDS-defining illness, so there are inroads there. So they made these 3 awards. It's publicly known for this. And one's at the University of North Carolina, worked with Merck. And so I'll just read. They got $6.3 million for their first year. There are 15 projects, 4 core facilities. They're located at multiple universities. This is pretty complicated stuff. If you ever had to sit down and write some of these proposals or review some of these proposals, there are a lot of moving parts involved with this. David Clifford is smiling here because, unfortunately, he's had to do this a number of times with the Neurology AIDS Research Consortium, which was highly successful in our institute for a number of years. So they say here simply that their goal was to enhance the understanding of how HIV/JC persists in antiretroviral therapies. Name your therapy here. Take your choice. Whatever monoclonal antibody therapy or drug-related therapy that puts patients at risk for PML. To develop drug candidates, it could to develop animal models. It could be to develop better cell culture systems. And leading towards therapies to target viral reservoirs. So I'm suggesting that this is, as we talk about these things, this is just an opportunity to be able, now that this meeting has been held, to say, let's think about something that's not just creative and new and innovative, but big. Because I think there's an opportunity here to be able to pull all of the stakeholders together to be able to solve the issues that we've been talking about at a time that's really critical when we have the attention, I think, of some of the funders. And that was my last slide.